Um, so yeah, what I will basically do is to look today very briefly at our predecessors, the earliest predecessor we have for how to write a commentary on the Proarchia in antiquity, teaching Proarchia in antiquity, and the look is at the late antique Scholia, which are connected to the monastery of Bobbio in Italy. Therefore, they are called the Scholia Bobiensia on Cicero's speeches. And I will not say anything very spectacular on those things. I will be very, very general. And I basically will want to ask the question, can that in any way be useful for us? And we will probably not be able to answer this question today, but I hope that we will be able to come back to similar questions in Ljubljana. So let me just see. Yeah, this one is a good one. So just very briefly on this Scholia Bobiensia, on the right side, you see what it is, namely a palimpsest. So they have been transmitted in a palimpsest, so in a manuscript which was written, then scrapped out on parchment, then scrapped out to be reused for another text. And this makes a rather messy impression, and the text which stands on the wrong side, so to speak, which is upside down, that's the text which has been written later. So the better readable text is the one which does not interest us today. And this is one of the pages of which the editors say this is a really well-readable page. Some of them are really much worse. So it's quite a problematic text, which also quite some problems when it comes to textual transmission and when it comes to the actual edition of the text. Perhaps at a certain moment now with modern technologies, it might be possible to make a new edition of it. We'll see. So a palimpsest, which is now partly in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan and partly in the Biblioteca Apostolica in the Vatican. So it has been divided at a certain moment, the manuscript. The Scholia, so this late antique commentary and speeches of Cicero, was written shortly before or around 500 Christian age, and erased again probably around 700 Christian age. So about 2 centuries later, at the very early beginning of the Middle Ages, someone thought this is no longer interesting and we write something else about it. So that's the manuscript situation of this text. But researchers have good reasons to believe that the content of what we read is not a commentary which was produced around 500 CE, but in the 4th century CE. So perhaps late 4th century CE, that would make it a commentary which stems from the time of Augustine, of Jerome, of Macrobius, of Servius, so these kind of people, and thereby an interesting case of commentary and Cicero's speeches in a time when there was still a living tradition of teaching Latin with the help of these classical authors, which we now consider classical, in a kind of ongoing rhetorical grammatical tradition. What we have today is a commentary, or partly commentaries, because some of the commentaries are also not complete, of 12 speeches. But again, there are good reasons to believe that there was once a full commentary on all speeches of Cicero. But what we have is 12 speeches, among which the Proarchia. This commentary on the Proarchia is not very long. In a modern edition, it takes about 3 pages. It consists of a short argumentum, which is a very short summary of, well, kind of introduction and summary of the content of the speech and what it is all about, including some of the rhetorical things that are at stake. And then we have 29 commentary lemmata. So 29 things are explained, sometimes with very few words only, and sometimes with a slightly longer lemma. It was very clearly written for use in schools, I would say. It is something which goes back to all kinds of learned traditions. It takes up something which is already even older, probably a commentary of the 2nd century, reworks it. This is a living tradition. Commentaries are meant to be to evolve and not to be fixed texts, but they could be used, reused, rewritten. And so for use in schools, probably of a rhetoricus, perhaps also of a grammaticus, but more probably for a rhetoricus. So the second step of the secondary education of late antiquity. So what kind of things do we find in these scholia? First, this argumentum, so the summary, the brief summary of the and explanation of the case at stake. So that's how we would also start probably, but still when teaching a speech, before you start reading it, you will tell the students what it is about, what is the historical situation, why it is useful to read the speech, what kind of rhetorical interest might be there. So nothing really surprising in the retelling of this case there. You wouldn't think, wow, that's how we would not do it. It's written in a relatively easy Latin, not very complicated if you compare it to the Latin of Cicero. For example, here's one part of it. So Archias Heracleam venit, quae tunc erat civitas foederata, sorry for the typo, civitas foederata. Et adscriptus est in ordinem Heracliensium civis. Tunc Silvanus et Carbo consules legem tulerunt, od omnes, qui esset ex foederatis populis civitatem Romanam consequerentur. It's really easy going. I think we can all very easily understand that he comes to Heraclea, civitas foederata. He was inscribed there as a citizen. Then these consuls saw to it that everyone who was coming from these foederati people would also be able to get Roman citizenship. And this is the way of explanation we get in this retelling. The second thing which this argumentum is doing, defining the status of the speech, the status layer, this Hermagoras stuff of saying what kind of rhetorical strategy lies behind this speech. So how is what is the main strategy of the defender Cicero? That's also very important for all kinds of things in late antiquity. That was a thing which really had to be done always at the beginning. You have to know what status we are in. In this case, we are in the status conjecturialis, which means, did this thing actually happen or not? So is he really guilty or not of what he's been accused of? Was he really part of these archives in Heraclea? An adscriptus sit in ordinem Heracliensium. The last sentence also gives away that this whole speech is not only about this juridical case in the strict sense, just as we also find the speech interesting because it is so much about the value of literature and not only about these strict juridical arguments. Also, this latency commentator found that interesting. The last sentence says that Cicero leaves the status aside, omissa conjectura, that means the status conjecturalis, it leaves it away and talks about the question whether Archia shouldn't be a Roman citizen anyway. Doesn't matter how this whole process would develop. So I would say I found very similar interest in the way at least our Dutch group has been speaking about that. I think perhaps this part of this argumentum, which is written in relatively easy, approachable Latin, could be used in our commentary somewhere or in our teaching material somewhere as a nice and quick content overview in Latin for someone who wants to read that in Latin. And it could give historical depth to our endeavor just by showing that people have done very similar things before. The second thing about the lemmata, just to give two examples, what kind of lemmata are there? Well, very many of those are about names. Who are these people who are mentioned? And that's something we have always been wondering about too. So all these ancient names that come along are mentioned. Very often it's very easy. So who are the Luculi? Marcus and Lucius, one of Macedonia, the other one who triumphed in the war against Macedonia, and the other one in the war against Mithridates. That's the one explanation, again, very easy one. And then another one on Drusus. He was the very noble tribunus plebis, and defender of the Senate against the people, who later was killed within his own house. And what we see here is a nice treat of the commentaries more in general, that they very often take a very Ciceronian view. So they very often follow Cicero. It's almost as if Cicero himself would comment his own speeches, because this way of looking at Drusus, the Tribunus Plebis, is this very positive image of this tribune of the people, Drusus, is something which we find in Cicero's works more often. Cicero was a fan of Drusus. His own house later would be built on the place where Drusus's house have stood. So we see here a very commentator who says things as Cicero would have said them himself, I think. There's also context, not only names, but also historical context or general context about Ennius, for example, the Rudinus Homo. He was a Rudinian, this Ennius, and the elder Scipio loved him, and he was a close family member and even honored him with giving him a tomb. The tomb is also mentioned in the speech, and thus having included him among his ancestors. And then something which I found quite nice, that this commentator, of whom we do not know where exactly he was working, where he was writing, where his potential school was, or for what kind, was it in Rome, was it in the province, but obviously was interested in something of Roman topography, because he tells us where Ennius's tomb could be found, somewhere outside of the Porta Capena, about a mile from the city walls. Another thing which I found nice, because it is one of the slightly longer lemmas, is about the passage where it is said that even if you are approached by poets who give bad verses, you should be lenient, and then come historical examples of that. And this epigramma, which is written in alterni versus, is then used as a little excursus into literary history. What is alterni versus? That's elegiac couplets. And who were the elegiac poets? That's not really relevant for the speech, but that's good for a student of late antiquity to know some of the big names of the elegiac tradition. That means Antimachos, Achillochos, Mimnermus, and also Solon. And I added that in bold, because I think it's not by chance that he is made the link again to the speech. It's not only just poets who have written it for all kinds of different symposia or something, but also politicians. Solon, who wrote the Athenian laws, was also a poet of elegiac. So the connection which Cicero tries to make between literature and politics is also made by the commentator himself. So that I found very nice. And with that, I really come again to the question, could we do anything with some of these parts of the commentary in our commentary? And I would say, yes, I would love to have it, just to show the historical depth we have. Perhaps we could try to think, and that's something we can discuss then in Ljubljana more at length, to design a lesson in which students do as if they were sitting in the class of a late antique rhetor, so that then you get, for 45 minutes, are exposed to being explained the speech with the ancient lemmata, and just see how much of the speech would you actually understand if you only had these lemmata. Could be a nice experience. Or you could indeed show how some of our commentary is actually informed by these ancient scholia, that they were indeed interested in very similar things, and that some of the information we have about Cicero's brother being the praetor, or on the names, that these are actually the things we can also get from these scholia, so that we can rewrite that these scholia still are living in our own commentary. And the third option would perhaps be that you could also take a scholion and then let students reflect how different it is and how similar it is. So not only the similarities, but also the differences. Is it something which we still would do today? Is it didactically good to do it in this way? Or are there also very oddities, weirdnesses, lacunae? There are many lacunae, but which we wouldn't have. So these kind of things I would be curious to talk about when we meet again in Ljubljana, if we want to do something with commentaries, and we could extend that obviously also to commentaries from other periods, let's say from the Renaissance. And having said that, I thank you for your attention.